For 3 years, the people of Cedar Ridge could smell fresh bread every morning, but they never saw Jonas Mueller actually baking it. The German baker would lock his shop tight during the day, refusing customers who begged for even a single loaf, then work behind shuttered windows all night long. By dawn, his shelves would be filled with the finest bread west of Denver. But Jonas would claim he'd been asleep and had no memory of how it got there. The townspeople called him touched in the head, a man whose mind had been broken by the loneliness of frontier life. But when federal agents finally discovered what Jonas was really hiding inside his midnight loaves, they realized he hadn't been baking bread at all. He'd been baking messages that kept the Underground Railroad running across 3 territories. Jonas Mueller had arrived in Cedar Ridge, Colorado, in the spring of 1859, carrying little more than his father's sourdough starter, a collection of traditional Bavarian recipes, and dreams of bringing old-world craftsmanship to the American frontier. At 35 years old, Jonas possessed skills that were rare in the wilderness. The ability to create bread that rivaled anything found in the finest European cities, knowledge of fermentation and grain handling that had been passed down through 6 generations of his family, and most importantly, an understanding of how to hide things inside baked goods that would have impressed the smugglers and resistance fighters of his homeland. The bakery that Jonas established on Main Street quickly became the pride of Cedar Ridge. His bread was unlike anything the frontier settlers had ever tasted. Dense German rye that could sustain a man through a hard day's work, delicate wheat loaves that graced Sunday tables, and sweet pastries that made children line up outside his shop before dawn. Word of Jonas's talent spread throughout the territory, and soon people were traveling from 3 counties away just to taste bread made by the German master who had brought European traditions to the Colorado wilderness. What made Jonas special wasn't just his technical skill, but his genuine care for the people he served. He remembered every customer's preferences, saved special loaves for families going through hard times, and often accepted payment in kind from settlers who had more labor than cash. His bakery wasn't just a business. It was a gathering place where the community came together over shared meals and the comfort that only good bread could provide. But Jonas also carried secrets that he had hoped never to use again. During his youth in Bavaria, he had worked with underground networks that smuggled refugees across European borders, using his family's bakery as a way station for people fleeing political persecution and religious oppression. Jonas had learned to hide documents inside bread crusts, to encode messages in the patterns of seeds on loaf tops, and most importantly, to recognize the signs of people who desperately needed help but couldn't ask for it directly. The transformation of Jonas's routine began in the winter of 1861, when a woman arrived at his bakery just as he was closing for the day. She was clearly not from Cedar Ridge. Her clothes were worn from hard travel. Her shoes were splitting from long miles on foot, and her eyes held the particular kind of wariness that came from being constantly hunted. She didn't ask for bread or shelter. Instead, she simply stood at his counter and spoke a single phrase in German. The crust that holds the truth feeds those who hunger for freedom. Jonas felt his blood run cold. It was a code phrase he hadn't heard in 15 years, words that identified the speaker as someone connected to the underground networks that helped people escape from oppression. But this wasn't Europe, and the oppression here had a different face: the systematic enslavement of human beings and the brutal pursuit of those who sought freedom. The woman, who introduced herself only as Anna, explained that she was part of a growing underground railroad network that was helping escaped slaves reach safety in Canada. But the network faced a critical problem. Communication between stations was dangerous and unreliable. Written messages could be intercepted and decoded. Verbal communications required face-to-face meetings that exposed operatives to capture, and the distances involved made real-time coordination nearly impossible. "We need someone who can hide messages where no one would think to look," Anna explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone whose work naturally involves traveling to multiple locations, whose products are handled by many people, but whose purpose is so innocent that no one would suspect hidden meanings. Jonas understood immediately what she was asking. His bread already traveled throughout the territory, carried by travelers and delivered to customers across hundreds of miles. If he could encode messages within his baked goods, he could create a communication network that was both invisible and essential to the communities it served. The decision that would change Jonas's life came not from sudden moral clarity, but from memories of his own family's history of persecution in Europe and his understanding that the skills he had inherited were meant to serve purposes larger than simply feeding people's hunger for food. Within a week, he had agreed to transform his bakery into a communication hub for the Underground Railroad network operating throughout Colorado Territory. The system that Jonas developed was deceptively simple but extraordinarily sophisticated. Different types of bread would convey different types of information. Dark rye indicated the number of escaped slaves traveling north. Wheat loaves provided information about safe routes and dangerous areas, and specialty breads contained detailed intelligence about the movements and methods of slave catchers. The real messages, however, were hidden inside the bread itself. Using techniques he had learned from European resistance networks, Jonas began incorporating thin sheets of rice paper into his bread dough. These papers, waterproofed with a special wax coating, could be kneaded into the center of loaves where they would remain completely hidden until the bread was broken open by someone who knew where to look. The papers contained coded information about Underground Railroad operations, arrival times for groups of fugitives, changes in safe house locations, warnings about compromised routes, and intelligence about the activities of federal marshals and professional slave catchers. But creating the message system was only part of the challenge. The other part was maintaining his cover as Cedar Ridge's baker, while secretly coordinating a network that would eventually span 3 territories and save hundreds of lives. This required Jonas to develop operating procedures that would seem strange to his customers, but would actually serve the Underground Railroad's needs for secrecy and security. Jonas's decision to bake only at night was the cornerstone of his operational security. During daylight hours, when federal marshals and slave catchers might be watching, Jonas kept his bakery closed and claimed to be sleeping or attending to personal business. But after midnight, when the town was asleep and hostile observers were unlikely to be conducting surveillance, Jonas would begin the complex process of encoding and baking the messages that kept the Underground Railroad network functioning. The night baking also served another crucial purpose. It allowed Underground Railroad operatives to visit Jonas's bakery without being seen by townspeople who might ask uncomfortable questions or report suspicious activities to authorities. Fugitive slaves, safe house operators, and network coordinators could approach the bakery under cover of darkness, receive or deliver intelligence, and disappear back into the night without exposing themselves or the people they were trying to protect. Jonas's apparent memory loss about his baking activities was a carefully crafted deception designed to protect both himself and his customers. If questioned by authorities about his unusual schedule or about specific loaves that might have been discovered to contain hidden messages, Jonas could claim complete ignorance about how the bread had been made or what it might contain. This plausible deniability was essential for maintaining his cover and ensuring that the discovery of one compromised message wouldn't expose the entire network. The townspeople's interpretation of Jonas's behavior as evidence of mental illness actually worked to his advantage. People were reluctant to bother someone they believed to be struggling with psychological problems, and authorities were less likely to suspect criminal activity from someone who appeared to be suffering from a medical condition. Jonas's apparent confusion and memory gaps made him seem like an unlikely candidate for involvement in sophisticated intelligence operations. The quality of Jonas's bread never suffered despite the complexity of his hidden activities. If anything, The special care required to incorporate secret messages into his baking made his products even more remarkable. The process of hiding rice paper documents inside bread dough required extraordinary precision and skill, and Jonas developed techniques that enhanced both the flavor and texture of his breads while serving the Underground Railroad's communication needs. The first successful test of Jonas's message system came in February 1862, when a group of 8 escaped slaves arrived in Cedar Ridge following directions that had been encoded in a pumpernickel loaf delivered to a safe house operator 50 miles south. The fugitives had been guided along a route that avoided federal patrols and hostile settlements, following instructions that were hidden inside bread that had been shared as a simple meal among Underground Railroad operatives. As word of Jonas's capabilities spread through Underground Railroad circles, his bakery became a crucial link in a communication network that extended from Kansas to the Canadian border. Messages would arrive in Cedar Ridge hidden inside incoming bread deliveries, and Jonas would re-encode and redistribute the intelligence through his own products, creating a web of information that allowed the network to coordinate complex operations across vast distances. The scope of intelligence that flowed through Jonas's bakery was staggering. He received and transmitted information about the movements of hundreds of escaped slaves, the locations and capacities of safe houses throughout the territory, the activities and methods of professional slave catchers, and the attitudes and reliability of local authorities in dozens of communities. Most importantly, he coordinated the timing of operations that required precise synchronization across multiple locations. Dr. Sarah Crawford was among the first local residents to become part of Jonas's network. As the only physician in Cedar Ridge, she was naturally involved in providing medical care to injured fugitives, but her connection to Jonas allowed her to expand her role significantly. She would receive medical supplies and coded instructions hidden inside specially marked loaves, allowing her to prepare for the arrival of specific patients and to coordinate with medical providers in other communities. The schoolteacher, Mary Thompson, became another crucial link in the network when she began receiving educational materials hidden inside Jonas's bread. These weren't just basic literacy materials, but sophisticated documents that helped escaped slaves learn to read and write well enough to create new identities and integrate into free communities. Mary would extract these materials from specially marked loaves and distribute them through her own network of safe house operators and conductors. Even a local minister, Reverend William Hayes, became involved when he started finding sermons and biblical passages hidden inside communion bread that Jonas provided for church services. These weren't random religious texts, but carefully chosen passages that contained coded information about Underground Railroad operations. The Reverend would incorporate specific phrases and references into his sermons, creating a public communication system that allowed the entire community to receive updates about network activities without anyone outside the organization understanding the true meaning. But the most dangerous aspect of Jonas's operation was the constant risk of discovery by federal marshals and professional slave catchers who were specifically trained to detect Underground Railroad activities. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had made assisting escaped slaves a federal crime punishable by imprisonment and heavy fines, and specialized law enforcement units had been created to track down and destroy Underground Railroad networks. Marshal Frederick Kane was the most feared slave catcher operating in Colorado Territory, a man whose reputation for brutality was matched only by his skill at infiltrating and destroying Underground Railroad operations. Kane understood that successful networks required sophisticated communication systems, and he had developed techniques for detecting and intercepting Underground Railroad messages that had destroyed several networks throughout the region. Kane's arrival in Cedar Ridge in the autumn of 1863 marked the beginning of the most dangerous period of Jonas's Underground Railroad career. The marshal had been tracking a pattern of successful escapes that seemed to originate from somewhere in the Colorado Territory, and his investigation had led him to suspect that Cedar Ridge was a major communication hub for Underground Railroad activities. Kane's investigative methods were systematic and thorough. He began by studying the movement patterns of known Underground Railroad operatives, looking for common destinations and timing correlations that might reveal the location of communication centers. He also analyzed the success rates of escape operations in different areas, searching for anomalies that might indicate the presence of particularly effective networks. What drew Kane's attention to Jonas wasn't suspicious behavior, but rather the absence of logical explanations for certain patterns he had observed. Escape operations throughout the territory seemed to be coordinated with an efficiency that suggested real-time communication capabilities, but Kane's agents hadn't been able to identify any of the usual methods of Underground Railroad communication. The breakthrough in Kane's investigation came when he realized that the most successful escape routes all passed through or near communities that had high-quality bakeries. This seemed like a coincidence until Kane began to understand that bread was one of the few products that naturally traveled between communities, was handled by multiple people, and was consumed completely, leaving no evidence of its original contents. Kane's surveillance of Jonas's bakery began subtly, with agents observing the building from a distance and noting the unusual pattern of nighttime activity. Kane was too experienced to conduct obvious surveillance that might alert his target, so he relied on long-term observation and pattern analysis to understand the true nature of Jonas's operations. The evidence against Jonas began to accumulate slowly but steadily. Kane's agents documented the unusual timing of Jonas's baking activities, the pattern of nocturnal visitors to his bakery, and most importantly, the correlation between specific bread deliveries and successful Underground Railroad operations in distant communities. But Kane needed direct evidence of message transmission before he could make arrests that would stand up in federal court. The crisis that would ultimately expose Jonas's activities began when one of Kane's agents discovered a partially dissolved rice paper document in a loaf of bread that had been purchased from a merchant who regularly bought products from Jonas's bakery. The paper was too damaged to reveal much information, but chemical analysis confirmed that it contained written intelligence of the type used by Underground Railroad networks. Kane's response to this discovery was swift and comprehensive. Rather than immediately arresting Jonas, the marshal decided to continue surveillance while attempting to intercept and decode more messages. Kane understood that Jonas was probably part of a larger network, and he wanted to gather enough evidence to destroy the entire organization rather than just capturing one operative. But Kane's expanded surveillance also meant that Jonas's activities were now under constant observation by hostile forces. Every loaf he baked, every visitor he received, and every delivery he made was being monitored by federal agents who were specifically looking for evidence of Underground Railroad activities. The margin for error had essentially disappeared. The warning that Kane was closing in came through the same bread-based communication system that had served the network so well. A message hidden inside a dinner roll informed Jonas that federal agents had been asking questions about his bakery in 3 different communities, and that several Underground Railroad operatives had reported increased surveillance in areas where Jonas's bread was regularly delivered. Jonas faced the most difficult decision of his career: shut down his operation immediately and abandon the network that depended on his communication services, or continue operating while knowing that discovery could result in his arrest and the exposure of hundreds of Underground Railroad operatives throughout the territory. The solution Jonas chose was characteristically selfless and strategically sound. Rather than simply stopping his Underground Railroad activities, he began implementing a planned shutdown that would allow existing operations to be completed while gradually transferring his communication responsibilities to other network members. This process would take several weeks and would require Jonas to continue baking message-laden bread while under federal surveillance. Jonas's final weeks of operation were a masterpiece of deception and operational security. He continued his normal pattern of nighttime baking while secretly encoding warnings and shut down instructions into his bread. He also began training other bakers in the network to take over his communication responsibilities, ensuring that the loss of his bakery wouldn't cripple the Underground Railroad's ability to coordinate operations. The messages Jonas baked during this period were different from anything he had created before. Instead of routine intelligence and coordination information, his loaves contained detailed instructions for destroying evidence, relocating safe houses, and establishing alternative communication methods. He was essentially baking the dissolution of his own network while creating the foundation for a new one that could operate without him. But Jonas's most important final act was ensuring the safety of the 43 escaped slaves who were currently traveling through routes that depended on his communication network. These fugitives were scattered across 3 territories, following paths that had been coordinated through Jonas's message system, and they would need guidance and support to reach safety even if his bakery was shut down. The coordination required to safely evacuate 43 people from a compromised network while under federal surveillance pushed Jonas's abilities to their absolute limits. He had to encode individual route changes for each group, coordinate with dozens of safehouse operators, and time everything perfectly to avoid creating patterns that Kane's agents might detect. Jonas's final night of baking was both triumph and tragedy. He successfully completed the evacuation of all 43 fugitives, encoding the last of their route instructions into loaves that would guide them to safety in Canada. But he also knew that this would be the last time he would use his family's traditional recipes to serve the cause of human freedom. The raid on Jonas's bakery came at dawn on December 15, 1863. Marshal Kane arrived with 6 federal agents and a warrant authorizing the search and seizure of any items connected to Underground Railroad activities. Jonas was arrested without resistance, though he maintained his cover story that he was simply a baker who worked unusual hours due to personal eccentricities. What Kane found in the bakery exceeded his expectations. Not only were there dozens of rice paper documents in various stages of preparation, but Jonas had also kept detailed records of his message encoding techniques, though these records were disguised as traditional German baking recipes. To untrained observers, the documents looked like family cooking instructions. To Kane, who had been studying Underground Railroad methods for years, they looked like the operational manual for the most sophisticated communication network he had ever encountered. The trial of Jonas Mueller became a sensation throughout Colorado Territory and beyond. Newspapers reported extensively on the case of the baker, who had allegedly used bread to coordinate Underground Railroad operations across 3 territories. The technical details of the rice paper message system fascinated readers who had never heard of such sophisticated methods being used by anti-slavery networks. Jonas's defense was handled by a team of abolitionist lawyers who argued that baking bread was not inherently illegal and that the prosecution had failed to prove any direct connection between Jonas's baking activities and specific Underground Railroad operations. They portrayed Jonas as an immigrant craftsman whose traditional European techniques had been misinterpreted as evidence of criminal conspiracy. But the prosecution's case was strengthened by the testimony of Underground Railroad operatives who had been captured during other operations and who provided details about message-based communication systems used throughout the territory. These witnesses confirmed that bread-based messages had been used to coordinate illegal activities, though none could directly implicate Jonas in specific crimes. The verdict was perhaps inevitable given the overwhelming evidence of Jonas's technical sophistication and the clear connection between his baking activities and Underground Railroad operations. He was found guilty of conspiracy to violate federal fugitive slave laws and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The sentence was considered harsh even by contemporary standards, reflecting federal authorities' determination to make an example of anyone who developed innovative methods for assisting escaped slaves. But Jonas's conviction was only part of the story. The exposure of the bread-based communication system led to increased scrutiny of bakeries throughout the Western Territories, and several other Underground Railroad networks were discovered and destroyed as a result of techniques developed during Kane's investigation. The methods Jonas had pioneered were both his greatest contribution to the anti-slavery movement and the cause of significant damage to Underground Railroad operations. The technical innovations that Jonas had developed for Underground Railroad use had applications far beyond anti-slavery activities. Military intelligence agencies studied his methods for hiding messages in everyday objects, and his techniques for creating multi-layer communication networks influenced the development of more advanced espionage systems in later conflicts. The rice paper method became a standard technique for covert communications in hostile environments. Jonas served 12 years of his 15-year sentence before being released as part of a general amnesty for Underground Railroad operatives following the end of Reconstruction. He returned to Colorado Territory to find that his reputation had been completely transformed. Instead of being remembered as a baker who had lost his mind, he was now celebrated as an innovator who had used traditional craftsmanship to advance the cause of human freedom. The bakery on Main Street in Cedar Ridge had been converted into a museum commemorating Underground Railroad activities in Colorado Territory. Visitors could see examples of Jonas's message-hiding techniques and learn about the sophisticated communication systems that had been used to coordinate anti-slavery operations. The rice paper documents that had once been seen as evidence of criminal activity were now recognized as artifacts of technical innovation and moral courage. Jonas never returned to commercial baking after his release from prison. The years of imprisonment had taken a toll on his hands, and his ability to work with the precision that his message-hiding techniques had required. Instead, he became a teacher, sharing his knowledge of traditional European baking methods with a new generation of craftsmen, while carefully avoiding any mention of his Underground Railroad activities. The legacy of Jonas's bread-based communication system extended far beyond its immediate impact on Underground Railroad operations. His techniques for hiding information in everyday objects became models for resistance movements throughout the world, and his methods for creating secure communication networks influenced the development of modern intelligence operations. The principle that the most effective hiding places are often those that seem most ordinary became a cornerstone of covert communications. Years later, historians studying Underground Railroad activities would recognize Jonas Mueller as one of the most innovative technical minds of the anti-slavery movement. His bread-based message system represented a unique fusion of traditional craftsmanship and revolutionary purpose, demonstrating that the fight against injustice could be advanced through creativity and cultural knowledge, as well as courage and sacrifice. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge, who had once pitted Jonas for his strange nighttime baking schedule, eventually came to understand that they had been witnessing one of the most sophisticated resistance operations in American history. The man they had thought was losing his mind to isolation had actually been using his family's traditional skills to save lives and advance the cause of human freedom. Dr. Crawford, who survived the network's exposure and continued practicing medicine in Colorado Territory, often spoke about the honor of working with Jonas and the bread-based communication system. She described the experience of receiving medical instructions hidden inside dinner rolls as both thrilling and terrifying, knowing that each message represented another life that might be saved or lost depending on the network's success. Mary Thompson, who was forced to leave Colorado Territory after the network's exposure, eventually settled in Massachusetts, where she continued her work and education while maintaining the literacy materials that Jonas had hidden inside his bread. These documents became the foundation for educational programs that helped formerly enslaved people develop the skills they needed to build new lives in freedom. The rice paper messages themselves became artifacts of historical significance, studied by historians and intelligence analysts who marveled at the technical precision required to hide documents inside bread dough while maintaining the quality and appearance of normal baked goods. Museums throughout the American West displayed examples of Jonas's work, explaining to visitors how ordinary food had been transformed into a tool of resistance and liberation. Jonas Mueller died in 1889 at the age of 65, having lived to see the complete abolition of slavery and the recognition of his contributions to the Underground Railroad movement. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including many formerly enslaved individuals who credited their freedom to the communication network that his bread-based messages had made possible. The inscription on Jonas's gravestone, chosen by the survivors of his Underground Railroad network, reads simply, "He fed the hungry with bread and the oppressed with hope." The epitaph captures the essential duality of his work, that by appearing to serve only basic human needs, he had actually been serving the highest human aspirations for freedom and justice. The baker who had been mocked for his strange nighttime schedule had actually been operating one of the most effective resistance communications networks in American history. His story became a reminder that the most important work is often done in darkness, by people whose true contributions are not recognized until long after their sacrifices have changed the world. If you're enjoying these incredible, true stories of hidden innovation and resistance, hit that subscribe button, because we've got many more tales of ordinary people who used extraordinary methods to fight injustice waiting for you. Click on the video on your screen to hear another story about someone who discovered that sometimes the most powerful weapons against oppression are the most ordinary tools of daily life, proving that resistance can be baked into the very fabric of community survival.